These are the 3 horrifying relics of the Kakin Empire that are facilitating the succession contest. I'm going to tell you what they are, how they work, and what you've missed if you didn't read the different translations, as well as one dark secret about this particularly sinister relic. So look, this is a situation where no single translation of Hunter x Hunter quite managed to capture the full extent of what's happening here, and that could be a problem that Togashi even had when he was writing it in Japanese, because the chapter that this relic appeared in has been quite infamous on Twitter, as Togashi said that he spent more than 6 hours writing the dialogue for 406, and honestly, part of this may have been translating the love dial ability into the Hunter x Hunter language, which I was slightly disappointed that the official translation didn't touch. With Hunter x Hunter, I strongly recommend reading the official translation because a series this dense really requires the nuance and pragmatism of a professional. And we're going to see an example of that in this very video, actually, because one of the Kakin relics is translated radically differently in the official, and it is important to know why. But stuff like the love dial ability or why fan translations are necessary as well, because if you only read the official source, then you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff like this, because it's not like you can sit down and translate it yourself. The Hunter x Hunter language translates into Japanese, not English. But look, I had to put that over there, and we're going to talk about some relics. And the first thing that we need to note is that these 3 relics don't come out of nowhere. They're almost certainly based on the Imperial Regalia of Japan, which are 3 treasures that are presented to the new Emperor of Japan during the enthronement ceremony. Sounds very similar to the succession contest. But look, only 2 of these artifacts are actually presented. We'll get to the special case surrounding the 3rd one in a bit. It's very intriguing. But it does actually surprisingly inform the succession contest events, because these 3 relics represent the primary virtues of an emperor: valor, wisdom, and benevolence. And they also represent a unification of Japan's indigenous group with the comparatively newer arrivals, and are considered a symbol of unity of these 3 groups, which is extremely similar to the Kakin Empire, as in ancient times this nation was it was a series of feuding warlords threatening to erase one another from existence. And so these artifacts loosely correspond to their Kakin equivalents. The Kakin artifacts are probably seen as a symbol of unity for the empire as well, particularly because the succession contest is what unified it. So we'll start with the one that's most different from its real-life inspiration, being the Seed Urn, which would be the equivalent of the Yasakani no Magatama, which are a string of jade jewels. The Seed Urn is obviously not that, but they serve a very similar purpose. These jade jewels were made for a figure known as Amaterasu Omikami, who is the Japanese sun goddess who, after an argument with Susanoo, decided to hide in a cave, effectively removing the light and the sun from the world. Not a great situation to be in, because the world, it needs light and warmth to survive and thrive. But she was eventually lured out with this string of jewels, thus returning light and life to the world. And the purpose of the Seed Urn is quite similar in that it's designed to lure the princes into the contest from their position of dormancy. These princes are the light and the warmth of the Kakin Empire, and under the succession contest structure, the empire cannot thrive without them. And some princes, like the sun goddess, are less than enthusiastic about getting involved. They'd prefer to stay in their prince caves. Like Hulkenberg, who I think is most thematically relevant to this idea, a man who did not want to participate, but who was seen by a large percentage of the empire as the only person who could lead them into a future filled with more light and warmth. So he got lured out. But the Yasakani no Magatama wasn't just owned by the sun goddess. It was also given to her grandson to assist him in pacifying Japan, which is a similar function that the Seed Urn serves. It doesn't belong to any singular prince, but it does bestow them with its power to assist them in the contest by giving them each a guardian spirit beast to use for their campaign for the throne, which it does by using the life force of princes who have previously been sacrificed across previous generations of the contest. And that is likely the full purpose of the Seed Urn. I believe its job has long since been completed, and a second relic is now facilitating phase 2 of the contest. So let's talk about the Buddha statue, or at the very least what most people thought was a statue, because the official translation has revealed a very dark truth about exactly what this relic is. This is a crazy relic, because across the 3 different Hunter x Hunter translations I read, it has radically different names in all of them. And how does that happen? Togashi's troupe translated it as the sacred object that watches over the succession contest, the shrouded Zen Buddha. Meanwhile, Voracious Drake called it the religious idol overseeing the succession contest, the meditating Buddha. And then the official translation went and labeled it the divine mummy, overseer of the succession battle, the Lotus Anchorite. And this is a case where I feel that the official translation has done a much better job of conveying the true nature of this relic, because neither the words meditating nor Zen quite capture the severity of what this artifact represents. For some context, an anchorite is someone who withdraws from society for religious reasons kind of like becoming a hermit, but much more extreme. Because as an anchorite, as you can probably tell from the word anchor being part of its name, they take a strict vow of, I will stay in one place, usually quite small and confined. And so they spend the rest of their lives in permanently enclosed cells, usually about 3 to 4 meters in length and or width, generally directly attached to a church where people would provide them with food and such through small holes. And I should say that this practice was also used as a punishment, which is known as immurement, which is condemning criminals to a live entombment to starve to death. Not too dissimilar from anchorites, because these punishments were often carried out on church grounds as well. And I do think that it's very important context that the two non-official translations are missing right now, which is that each of the 14 princes are being subject to this process, whether they've chosen to anchor themselves to the battleground of the succession contest or whether they've been immured inside of it. This is a much more pragmatic translation, because what I believe Togashi is referring to with this is the process of, and let's get this name right, of Shoku Shinbutsu, which is the ritual of Buddhist mummification. And look, I don't think I can show any pictures of what this looks like because YouTube probably wouldn't like it. So enjoy whatever other fun visuals I can find while I explain this. The mummification starts with the pursuit of asceticism, the abstinence of worldly pleasures, and dedicating oneself purely to spiritual goals. And at a certain point, a monk can opt for the Shoku Shinbutsu, which is a self-performed mummification that takes place over approximately 3,000 days. During this time, a monk sustains themselves on pine needles, resins, and seeds found in the mountains, with the idea of which being to eliminate all fat in the body. Eventually, the monks would also slowly reduce their liquid intake and then stop it altogether and proceed to perform a chant until a state of death occurs, but in doing so, they leave their body as a naturally preserved mummy, with skin and teeth intact without the need for any sort of artificial preservatives. I go to all the effort to explain that process because I believe that this isn't just an artifact. The way the Lotus Anchorite is presented to us gives the illusion that it's a statue, because we know roughly the size of the other two relics, so we're using that to equate. But I think that this is a genuine mummy, as implied through the Divine Mummy name, and that someone went through the Shoku Shinbutsu ritual as a condition for the succession contest Nen ability to function, which obviously then becomes an invocation of postmortem Nen. What we're seeing here could very well be the first king of the Kakin Empire, the man who started the succession contest as a way to unite and prosper, because he himself would not have needed to participate in the contest. The first generation of contestants would have been his children, or I guess the children of his queens, given that that's a very specific rule. They don't have to be the child of the king, they just have to be the child of a legal queen. And actually, maybe we know why this is. Given how ravaged the ancient Kakin territories were by warlords, the first king may not have had 14 spare children laying around, and he may have decided to ceremonially marry a bunch of women and use their existing children as the first generation of Kakin princes to battle for the throne. Especially since back in these ancient times, marriages were less about love and such, and much more about forming political alliances. It could have even been a series of queens from the disputed territories all coming together to decide who would be the king. But otherwise, the first king would have had to spend decades producing his own biological children, and that's just counterproductive. It just takes too long. But the Kakin Empire is also very different from most monarchies that we would know of. The emphasis on blood relations and family dynasties don't really exist. The focus is at all times on the nation itself. And getting back to national symbolism, the real-world equivalent of the Lotus Anchorite is the Yata no Kagami, a bronze mirror enshrined in the Ise Grand Shrine as a Goshintai, which, if you remember from a previous video, is the exact terminology that Chrollo used to describe the Lotus Anchorite. It is a Goshintai, which means sacred body of the kami, which are objects said to contain spirits or even kami themselves. And in this case, I do feel like sacred body of the kami could be taken much more literally. And the Yata no Kagami represents wisdom, which is again reflected in the idea of the anchorite. Part of an anchorite's solitary and stagnant quest is to gain wisdom by being free not just from the distractions of society, but from the distractions of the world itself. The Yata no Kagami is also the only artifact not physically presented to the new emperor during the enthronement ceremony, because it is permanently housed within the Grand Shrine, meaning that it's entirely possible that our equivalent, the Lotus Anchorite, may not even be aboard the Black Whale 1, because that would, after all, break the whole idea of being an anchorite. This ability could be functioning from all the way back in the human realm. Or it could be mobile, but there may be a restriction that once the contest begins, it cannot be moved until the contest concludes. Now, as for what it does, the Divine Mummy enforces the boundaries of the contest and dispenses punishment to contestants who break those boundaries, and I also imagine that this is responsible responsible for masking the guardian spirit beast to the princes even once they learn Nen. And it's also possible that the divine mummy is the one that enforces the guardian spirit beast rules as well, which is that they can't attack princes nor can they attack other guardian spirit beasts. Meaning that if we found a way to get rid of this relic or deactivated it, then we'd be looking at a whole new level of chaos. There would be nothing to enforce the rules of the contest anymore. The princes would be able to see their own beasts and engage with each other a lot more directly. Although arguably there would be no reason to engage if this was deactivated, because the contest is now not happening unless it's still necessary because of our third relic. And this also had quite a few different names depending on the translation. Togashi's troop stated that this was the blade of succession to be passed on to the next king, the blade of divine favor, and whilst Voracious Drake agreed with the first part, he proceeded to label it as the blade of auspice, an auspice being a divine or prophetic token, and the official translation simplifies the idea by calling it the sword of good omens. So at least all three translations agree with the general idea of this relic. It's all very much about looking into the future, a gift of good things to come for the candidate that emerges from the succession contest. The idea that everything's uphill from here. And it corresponds to the real-life Kusanagi no Tsurugi, which literally means grass-cutting sword, and it's been used for a wide array of purposes in Japanese mythology, including slaying the Yamata no Orochi. However, it's not necessarily an exclusively good thing to have, as it is suspected that this sword caused the poor health and subsequent death of 40th Emperor Tenmu. And I do think that there is a more bleak side to receiving the Sword of Good Omens after victory in the succession contest, because it's very potentially to be used at the end of the ritual by taking the life of the previous king and adding that king's life force to the Kakin pool. I've mentioned this many times now, but there are 14 coffins ready and waiting to accept the bodies of 13 princes, so that 14th is going to be for something, and that something may very well be the soon-to-be unneeded body of King Nasubi himself. Emperor Tenmu, by the way, the one speculated to have been cursed by the real-life blade, he had 15 children, which is the amount currently attributed to King Nasubi. We have the 14 legal princes and the very illegal Morena Prudeau. Although again, at this point, a lot of the Kakin princes are in doubt in regards to their blood relations with Nasubi, but I did find it interesting that this specific number has been replicated. Could be a coincidence, and look, it probably is, but also maybe not. Sometimes Togashi goes to some pretty extreme lengths with these sorts of details. And I guess the question now becomes, which of these relics is Chrollo aiming for? Assumedly, he'd be happy with any of them, but also assumedly some would be easier to attain than others. For example, the Seed Urn is now the least important artifact and probably the most vulnerable, whilst the Lotus Anchorite is the most chaotic option to choose and probably the most beneficial for him to disturb, but it's also likely the most highly defended and most difficult to attain. And then there's the blade, which maybe that might be the way forward. Or we could even see ourselves going for multiple artifacts. Should Chrollo and Kurapika's goals link up, then Kurapika would definitely be more focused on the Lotus Anchorite, whilst Chrollo could have his eyes set elsewhere, and thus join forces to dispel this entire Kakin ritual once and for all.